The conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows, and I remember thinking as I walked in that morning that the city looked almost peaceful from up here, like nothing bad could happen this high up. My husband, Dennis, was already seated when I arrived. He didn't stand. He didn't look at me. He was leaning back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who has decided, before anything has been said, that he has already won. His attorney sat beside him, a man named Forsyth, silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of lawyer who charges $400 an hour and knows it shows. Forsyth had a yellow legal pad in front of him with maybe 3 lines written on it. That's how seriously they were taking this. My attorney Philippa touched my arm lightly as I sat down. She'd told me the night before to let her do the talking. I told her I would. I meant it. The mediator, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Caldwell, opened with the standard language about the process, the goals, the hope that both parties could reach an equitable agreement. Dennis checked his phone while she was still speaking. Forsyth smiled at something only he could see. That was the moment I thought about everything. 23 years of it. 23 years of being the one who built something, quietly, without ever needing anyone to applaud. I was 51 years old. I had gray at my temples that I had stopped coloring 2 years ago, because I simply ran out of reasons to hide it. I was wearing the charcoal blazer I bought for presentations, the one that made me feel like I could say hard things without my voice shaking. I needed it that morning. Because across the table, my husband of 23 years, a man I had loved, a man I had supported, a man whose business I had helped rescue from collapse not once but twice, was preparing to argue that I was entitled to almost nothing. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the oldest of 3 daughters. My mother was a teacher. My father was an electrician. We weren't poor, but we understood money as something you tracked carefully, something that didn't arrive without work attached to it. I studied accounting at Ohio State. Not because I dreamed of spreadsheets, but because I was good at understanding systems. How things fit together. How a small error in one column could quietly destroy everything downstream if you weren't paying attention. I liked that it was logical. I liked that the right answer existed, and that you could find it if you were careful enough. I graduated in 1994 and took a job at a regional manufacturing firm outside Cincinnati, entry level. Nothing glamorous. I wore blazers that were too big because I'd bought them used, and I brought my lunch every single day, and I learned everything I could about how a real business runs. Not the theory of it, but the actual machinery of it. The vendor contracts, the payroll cycles, the cash flow projections that keep a company alive month to month. I met Dennis at a company picnic in the summer of 1997. He was working in sales for a different division. He was funny and confident, and he had a way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the room. We dated for 2 years and got married in June of 1999, at a small church outside Columbus with 63 people in attendance, which I know because I made the seating chart. His name was Dennis Hale. I took his name because that's what I did back then, because it felt like the beginning of something and not the end of anything. For the first few years we were a team. That's the only word for it. He was building his client base. I was moving up, slowly, steadily, at a firm downtown. We shared an apartment, split the bills down the middle, talked about the future in that specific way young couples do, when the future still feels like something you can engineer if you try hard enough. Dennis left his salaried job in 2003 to start his own business. A regional distribution company, moving industrial equipment from manufacturers to contractors across the Midwest. It was a good idea. He had the relationships. What he didn't have was the operational structure to turn those relationships into a sustainable business. I built it for him. I want to be precise about that because it matters. I did not help. I did not support from the sidelines. I built the operational infrastructure of Dennis's company from the ground up in the evenings and on weekends while maintaining my own full-time position. I designed the inventory tracking system. I set up the vendor payment schedules. I created the cash flow model that let him know 3 months in advance whether he could take on a new contract or whether doing so would break him. I never asked for a title. I never asked for equity. I never asked to be acknowledged in the company materials or the pitch decks or the emails he sent to clients. He called it his company, and I let him. The first time it nearly failed was in 2007. A major client pulled out without warning, taking about 40% of the revenue with them. Dennis panicked. He was ready to walk away from the whole thing. I sat with the books for 3 days, restructured the debt. identified 2 smaller contracts he'd overlooked, and found a path through. He didn't lose the company. We didn't lose our house. He took his sales team out for dinner that Friday to celebrate the turnaround. I wasn't invited. I found out about it from the credit card statement. I didn't say anything about it. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was a private person, that I didn't need the credit, that what mattered was the outcome. I was good at telling myself things. By 2010, the company was profitable. Solidly, consistently profitable. Dennis hired a full operations manager, a man named Todd, and my unofficial role quietly disappeared, absorbed into a structure I had designed, operated by someone who was paid for it. Our daughter, Iris, was born in 2005. She was the uncomplicated joy of those years, the thing that made the rest of it worth sorting out. I coached her soccer team. I read to her every night until she was 11, and told me, gently, that she was a little old for that. I drove her to school at 7:15 every morning for 9 years because Dennis left early for client calls, and someone had to. By 2015, we were polite to each other in the way that people are polite when they have run out of the energy required to be anything else. I worked. He traveled. Iris started high school. The house was clean and the bills were paid, and something essential had gone missing, and neither of us seemed to want to do the work of finding it. I found out about the other woman in February of 2018. Her name was Courtney. She was 34. She worked for one of his vendors. I'm not going to spend much time on that part because the betrayal, as painful as it was, isn't really the story. What came after it is the story. Dennis asked for the divorce in March of 2018. He moved out in April. He hired Forsyth in May, and Forsyth had a theory. The theory was that I was a dependent spouse. In 23 years of marriage, I had earned my own income for all but 18 months. A gap when Iris was a newborn, and I had taken a short leave. I had a graduate degree I'd completed part-time in 2008. I was currently a senior financial controller at a mid-sized logistics company, managing a team of 11 and overseeing a portfolio of accounts worth several $100 million annually. I had my CPA license. I had my CMA designation. Forsyth's position was that my contributions to the marriage had been primarily domestic and supportive in nature. That Dennis's business success was the product of his own enterprise and effort, and that I was entitled to a limited maintenance agreement and a modest share of the marital assets. He put a number on the table in our first mediation session. I looked at the number. Philippa looked at me. I said nothing. Dennis watched me from across the table with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not cruelty exactly. Something more like certainty. Like he had figured out the formula for this situation, and he was confident in the answer. "You had a career, Ellen," he said, which was the first time he'd spoken directly to me since we sat down. "You were never the one carrying the weight of the business. You handled the household side of things. That's what this reflects." He said it the way you might explain something to someone who has misunderstood a simple fact. I looked at him for a long moment, then I looked at the window. At the city 14 floors below, going about its morning, I said, "Okay." Forsyth uncapped his pen. What I did not say was, "I have a folder." I had been building it since April. Since the week after Dennis moved out, when I sat in the kitchen at 10 o'clock at night and thought very clearly, someone is going to try to tell a story about who I am in this marriage. I need to make sure the documents tell a different one. I went back through 15 years of records. The accounting systems I'd built. I had the original files, time-stamped, in my name, saved on a hard drive that had lived in my home office since 2003. The restructuring analysis from 2007, I had the original Excel model with my formatting, my formulas, my notes in the comment boxes, the emails, hundreds of them. Dennis writing to me at 2 in the morning asking how to read the cash flow projection. Dennis forwarding client contracts asking me to check numbers before I sign. Dennis writing in 2009 to his own attorney on an unrelated matter. "My wife has been managing the operational finances since the beginning. She's the one you'd want to talk to about that." I had that email. I had printed it and put it in a clear sleeve, and it was in the folder that Philippa was holding in her lap at this very moment. I also had the valuations. This was the part Dennis didn't know about, and it was the part that mattered most. In 2005 and again in 2011, Dennis had pursued outside investment for the company. Both times the investors had requested formal business valuations. Both times, the valuations had included assessments of the company's operational systems and infrastructure as key contributors to its worth. The 2011 valuation specifically noted that the company's financial management framework was unusually sophisticated for a company of this size and represented significant embedded value. I had built that framework, I had the documentation to prove it, and the valuation reports, which Dennis had presumably forgotten about or assumed I didn't have access to, put a number on what that contribution was worth. It was not a small number. Philippa made a motion during the second session to enter the documents into the mediation record. Forsyth objected. Ms. Caldwell allowed it. I watched Forsyth page through the 2011 valuation. I watched his face change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like the movies. He didn't stand up and demand a recess. He just got very quiet and very still, and he set the report down on the table in front of him, and he didn't pick it up again. Dennis didn't understand what he was looking at. He leaned over and whispered something to Forsyth, and Forsyth whispered back, and Dennis sat up straighter and looked at me across the table with an expression that was no longer certain. "Where did you get those?" he asked. "I've had them since 2011, I said. "You CC'd me on the investor communications. I kept everything." There was a silence. "I'd like a few minutes," Forsyth said to Ms. Caldwell. She nodded. We stepped out. Philippa and I stood in the hallway outside the conference room. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You did that very well." "I just told the truth," I said. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what you did." I looked out the hallway window, 14 floors down, the same city, same morning light. I had spent 23 years being the person who understood how everything worked while remaining invisible in the accounting of it. I had let that happen. I had chosen it, or at least I had not chosen otherwise, which amounts to the same thing. That was on me. But what someone else does to you, that's on them. Dennis had stood in a room and told a story in which I was a supporting character in my own life. He had counted on me not being able to correct the record. He had counted on my documents being gone, or incomplete, or not what I thought they were. He had forgotten, apparently, that I was an accountant. I keep records. The settlement conference 3 weeks later was quieter than I expected. Forsyth had dropped the dependent spouse framing entirely. The new number on the table was different, substantially different. It included a fair share of the marital home, a meaningful maintenance figure, and, after some additional negotiation, an acknowledgement of my contribution to the business that was reflected in a lump sum settlement that I am not going to specify because it's private, but I will tell you it was fair. More than fair. Iris came home for a long weekend in November, halfway through her sophomore year at Michigan. She sat at the kitchen counter while I made dinner, and she asked me, in the direct way she has always had, whether I was okay. "Better than I expected to be," I told her. "Dad said the settlement took longer than he thought it would," she said. I handed her a piece of bread to tear. "Did he?" "He seemed surprised," she said. "Like something didn't go the way he planned." I thought about how to answer that. Iris is 20 years old and she is nobody's fool, and she deserves the truth in age-appropriate form. She also loves her father, and she should. He is her father. "Your dad underestimated some things," I said finally. "He's done it before. He usually figures it out eventually." Iris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He underestimated you, didn't he?" "It wasn't really a question. A lot of people have," I said. "It used to bother me more than it does now." She looked at me for a long time in that way she has sometimes, like she's trying to memorize something. Then she picked up her phone and went back to whatever she was doing, and I stood at the stove and let the quiet settle around me like something I had earned. I want to say something to anyone who's listening. Anyone who has ever been in a room where someone was rewriting the story of your life while you sat there and said nothing. The not saying anything is not the problem. Sometimes silence is just strategy. Sometimes you're waiting for the right moment to let the document speak, because documents don't get nervous, and they don't hedge, and they don't adjust their language based on who's in the room. The problem is when we stay invisible on our own behalf, when we do the work and then make ourselves small, when we build the foundation of something and then let someone else put their name on the cornerstone. Not because we were forced to, but because we didn't think it mattered, or because we were trying to be gracious, or because somewhere along the way we absorbed the idea that wanting credit for what you built makes you difficult. It took me until I was 51 years old, sitting 14 floors above a city that didn't know my name, to understand that keeping records is not pettiness, it's not revenge, it's just accuracy. It's the insistence that things happened the way they happened, and that the truth doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. Dennis called me the household side of things. The documents called me something else. I spent 23 years making sure those documents were correct. And when the moment came, I was ready. That's the only kind of victory I was ever interested in. Not the loud kind, not the kind that needs an audience. Just the kind where, when someone finally asks the right question, the answer is already there, waiting, filed correctly, in a clearly labeled folder. The strongest position in any room is the one where you already know what the truth is, and you have the receipts to prove it.